agriculture, agriculture including rice, sugar, pineapples, and bauxite mining. It's they also highlighted the ability to repatriate profits as a major attraction from a business perspective in the area. And it's clear that this is one of the most exciting business stories in the world. With and one of the things that came up last time was that Guyana's GDP growth in 2020 topped 40% annually, which is pretty significant. On top of that, just so you know, never in my career in the oil and gas industry have I worked in a country that was blessed by a huge resource like this and was one of the top ecotourism destinations in the world. Usually it's the opposite. Usually you get a huge oil fields and they're at the bottom of the list of ecological sites. So this is really special. It's a really special situation, and it's really a wonderful time in human history where we're actually thinking about ecological development as well as energy. So let's get started. This week's session is mostly going to be focused on Suriname. So first up, we have Dr. Brian Glover, who's the VP of Offshore Upstream at Statoil, which is the vertically integrated state-owned company, oil and gas company in Suriname. Dr. Glover has a bachelor's degree in geology and mineralogy and a PhD in sedimentology and basin evolution. He has a distinguished career in exploration and production prior to Statoil, leading companies including Seacrest, Azimuth, the Mole Group in Hungary, and Tullow in London. And he's published more than 30 internationally recognized papers and books on sedimentology, reservoir modeling, and analysis. So, Brian, would you give us an update on the offshore development and other economic development in Suriname?
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. And it's a great pleasure to be able to join all of you in this second session. I hear great things about the first session, and I'm very privileged to be part of this particular session. Peter, I'm very sorry for giving you all those long words for you to explain in my introduction. So I'll try and keep these things relatively simple so that people get a good understanding of what the update is. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen and just walk through a few slides with respect to activities in Suriname. It's been a remarkable 15 months for the country with discovery starting just in January. I was very fortunate that I actually joined Statoil 6 days. Sorry, hopefully you got the right screen. Now you can see it. 6 days after the announcement of the first discovery. And since then, it's been an incredible year. And of course, we've continued that into 2021. I'm conscious of the fact that we have Tom Fourier following up, who's going to talk a lot more in detail with respect to the history of exploration and what's happening now in Suriname. So I'm going to focus a little bit more, firstly on Statoil, secondly about what's about to come up in the course of the next 5 to 10 years in the country. And then I want to talk about some of the challenges and the opportunities that Suriname represents, not only to the people of Suriname, but to the wider business community within upstream and beyond that particular area of business. So just first up, a cautionary statement, anything I'm saying, don't use it to invest, etc. I'm not going to read this out. And of course, anything that I might say is our or we or us, maybe one of our subsidiaries. So that's enough from our lawyer. We'll move on, as I say, we'll talk about exploration briefly and then into opportunities and challenges. Statoil has actually been around since 1980. And one of the big differences, therefore, we have compared with Guyana is that as a national oil company, we have a vested interest to ensure that as discoveries are made in Suriname, that we follow that process, that we engage with the operators and we ensure that we maximize the benefit of the resource for the people of Suriname and obviously for the company of Statoil. So our process started early. We are a dual role. We are the commercial company. We have onshore production. We produce about 6 million barrels a year, which isn't much, but it's enough to actually fuel our refinery, which allows for products to be sold into the market. We also provide power into Paramaribo and everywhere else within the country. that is connected to the grid, and that's a mixture of hydro and thermal power. With respect to our role as the regulator, as I said, we already oversee what's been going on in the shallow and the deep offshore, and I'll talk about both. But most recently, we've actually institutionalized the Hydrocarbon Institute. So now it's a standalone organization. With time, that will move away from Staatsolie as we expect revenues to be generated in future years. So that's an important evolution for us to make, and we want to ensure transparency throughout that process so that Staatsolie is recognized as a world leader in terms of operating as a national oil company and a regulator. So 40 years, as I say, production since the mid-80s. So we're very familiar with the industry, but we're not that familiar with the offshore industry. And of course, that's where all of the activities have been recently, which have been making the news. You can see on the right-hand side, I hope, I'll just get my cursor to turn into a pointer, that I put this little golden ellipse on here. This is what people are referring to as a sort of golden lane of discoveries. And this is ExxonMobil on the western side of the Surinamese boundary, with an amazing number of discoveries in the Stabroek block, and of course more recently Apache last year, and then Total are following up with activities this year. It's been an incredibly busy year, and if we look towards what else is happening in coming weeks and months, we have appraisal wells being drilled right now in the Block 58 area by Total, 2 wells, Sapakara West and Sapakara South. We have another exploration well going on to the north. We've had Tullow's well, which was not a success. And if we go a little bit further, we also have to the south a shallow offshore bid round. So why have we decided to run a bid round when all of these activities are going on in the deep offshore? Well, it's very simple. These are our discoveries, and of course the ExxonMobil discoveries, but these are our producing fields right here. And what we've seen since we've drilled several wells now in this area in the near shore is that we see very similar shows across this entire area, but we don't yet have 3D to be able to pinpoint exactly where to drill. We ran this bid round starting in the last quarter of 2020, and we're just closing it right now. We had an unbelievable number of interested parties. We eventually signed up 25 parties who were registered to consider bidding. And that is unprecedented, certainly in my career. And it just shows the interest that Suriname has. It's remarkable to think a small country like Suriname, even 24 months ago, wasn't really known by many people in the world, but now everybody says either they've been there or their uncle or their auntie's been there. It really is well known to the business and beyond. Remarkable turnaround in such a short period of time. So as I say, very busy time for Suriname. We not only have activities in the offshore, but we have activities on the onshore. As I mentioned, our business is producing heavy oil, which we refine and we also use for power. But we have small companies such as Bahamas Petroleum, and we also have Decker in the southwest, both of whom are drilling a mixture of exploration wells and testing for future hydrocarbons adjacent to our fields. So we're hoping that will continue our oil production story in the onshore whilst things start to blossom in the offshore. I'm going to move on from here and talk a little bit about what the implications are in terms of what the next steps will look like. So it's great having discoveries, and we've obviously got appraisal wells drilling. You'll notice up in the corner here, I've just highlighted the fact that we estimate first oil to be, well, I would say just around the corner, 2025. Middle of 25 is where Total are posting first oil. That'll be the first FPSO of 120,000 barrels a day, just like the Lisa FPSO, which will be brought into Suriname to produce the first fields. And of course, there's much more to come with so many discoveries. We see many more years of appraisal and development ahead of us. We also see a very healthy exploration activity over the course of the next 10 years, both in the deep water and the shallow offshore. And hopefully we will see that in the onshore as well. But still what? I mean, what does this all mean, and what does it mean for Suriname? I think for us, what's absolutely key is not just about the activities offshore, it's about ensuring that we are able to develop local content and develop opportunities for inward investment. I'll show you a few slides, a few pictures in a moment of what we see as being the typical sort of shore base that will be developed in Suriname. But it's also important to highlight that this basin doesn't just have oil, it has gas as well. And whilst oil will be the focus of the early investments, gas will follow. It's associated gas, so it's complex, and we need to produce the oil before we produce the gas. But we would expect by 2030, 2035, gas production would also take place in Suriname. We've done a recent study to try and assess how much gas we think is in the basin in Suriname, and we would expect that to be somewhere between 25 and 30 TCF. So it's not a small number at all. It's a significant number, a number large enough potentially to create commercial opportunities in the LNG market or the FLNG market, or even a CNG market moving, for example, by pipeline towards Trinidad and Tobago, who are obviously very keen to see more gas into their marketplace. So with that process, we expect the economy to improve. We expect new markets to open up, especially with the advent of gas. This will give another power source, and this will really diversify the marketplace. And ultimately, we want to build on capabilities we have in Suriname already through Staatsolie's service providers and build into a solid goods and service provision with many business opportunities, not just for local people, but for within the region. And with respect to foreign investment, actually, there is a ministerial delegation to the US right now. And I'm focused on Texas, I might add. And they are visiting a number of opportunities for foreign investment back into Suriname. And finally, it's important to highlight that we already have a university who are churning out high quality students working already in the industry, but we need to diversify this further to ensure that we're actually able to sustain our business and ultimately ensure that we transition from oil production to gas production, and ultimately gas is the basis for power generation. Now, finally on this slide, I just wanted to highlight the fact that the Sovereign Wealth Fund is already set up in Suriname. This was set up in 2018, and it was actually set up for mining and the revenue that was generated from the refinery. We built a world-class refinery back in 2018. So this is already in place, and it will really help ensure that when there were issues perhaps before of transparency, etc., that these can be far better managed by having such a sovereign wealth fund in place. I think secondly, it's also important to add that with such a structure in place, we should be able to avoid the dreaded Dutch disease of currency overpowering, etc. So that's what we hope to have in place, but it's very early days. It's 15 months into a process of discovery. So we've moved a lot of distance, but we still need to go a long way. So sovereign wealth will be critical. Cash flow will come back into a much needed economy. We'd expect inward investments to be critical to that, and local content building an able workforce. Just a quick sneak preview of a shore base, and I'll talk briefly about gas. There are different types of shore bases that we've looked at. It's most likely we focus on something such as an onshore terminal, and this is the basis of local content development. This is where local companies can partner with international companies and generate their own capabilities and employment for the country. So this will be absolutely critical. On the other side of the slide, we've just highlighted the fact we've looked very carefully at gas options. We expect two routes. One is actually into local industry, which we think is a little bit limited, obviously, in today's world, but there are other opportunities, maybe such larger industrial opportunities, which may not carry favor in the global marketplace today, but they need to be considered. But finally, we actually see great commercial opportunities for gas from an export perspective. I just want to talk for one last minute on this subject. We heard up front from Peter that Guyana had a very high rate of ecotourism, and Suriname is no different. It is the most forested country in the world. 93% of its territory still remains in forest. We're very keen to ensure that the revenue that's generated from oil and gas is plowed back into this forest so that we ensure that we're able to sustain it and to continue to reduce the amount of logging that's taking place. We are part of the RED initiative in Suriname, which is very much about reducing deforestation. And we want to also ensure, along with the government, that the revenues from oil and gas are used to these best ends. So I'll finish there and make sure the rest of my colleagues have a chance to talk, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Glover. That was very interesting. Thanks for making the bridge to last week's discussion too. And oh, and by the way, thank you for that bio with all those full of words with greater than 6 syllables in them. So next up, to build on this, we're going to have Tom Foria, who was the former country manager for Cosmos for 4 years in Suriname. And Tom has 30 years of upstream exploration experience that includes management and technical roles with Cosmos Energy, Repsol, Hess, Triton Energy, and Conoco. Mr. Foria has a BS degree in geology from Notre Dame and an MS degree in geophysics from Purdue University. Tom's going to give us some background on the general offshore and the business environment in Suriname. So over to you, Tom.
All right, good morning and hello to everybody. I'll say first off that the comments that I have over the next 10 minutes or so are from the point of view of an international oil company. So first, let me talk about the status of the oil and gas industry offshore, and then I'll turn and talk a little bit about the business environment. First, I think it's very interesting to recognize that offshore exploration has been ongoing in the region since the 1960s. In fact, between the 1960s and early 2015, 32 wells were drilled offshore Suriname and 13 offshore Guyana. However, all this drilling was focused on the nearshore and shallow water areas, and no commercial discoveries were found. Therefore, from the oil and gas perspective, this basin has been considered frontier and high risk. Then in about 2010, in the next few years, several oil and gas companies began to focus on the potential of the deep waters offshore Suriname, and several production sharing agreements were signed by Cosmos, Tullow, Petronas, Apache, and later others. And again, the focus being the deep waters in the offshore area. Similar focus, or refocus, if you will, was ongoing next door in Guyana, where Exxon was the primary player looking at the potential of the deep water. And of course, we know that this led to the drilling in 2015 in Guyana of the Lisa discovery, which confirmed the very high potential of the deep water parts of the basin. Many of you are probably aware that since 2015, Exxon has drilled 18 discoveries and reportedly discovered over 8 billion barrels of recoverable oil. This is a remarkable track record by oil and gas standards. Several discoveries are under development, and production is currently at over 100,000 barrels per day and is expected to ramp up to about 750,000 barrels per day by 2026, when multiple fields are in production. So that's Guyana. What about Suriname? In Suriname, success in the offshore has been a little more elusive. Drilling did begin also in 2015 in offshore Suriname. Apache drilled the first deep water well in 2015, followed by a second in 2017. Both were unsuccessful. Petronas drilled a failed well in 2016. Us at Cosmos Energy drilled 2 failed deep water exploration wells in 2018, and then Tullow drilled 2 additional failed wells in 2017 and 2021. However, as Brian noted in the prior presentation, there has been recent success. Apache, so their perseverance has paid off, and they've drilled 4 discoveries in Block 58 between 2019 and 2021. Also, Petronas has reported the discovery in Block 52 in 2020. So this is all very exciting news for Suriname, and it's certainly a cause for celebration. But it's also very important to recognize that these discoveries have not yet been appraised and confirmed to be commercial. Brian has just mentioned in the prior presentation that appraisal is currently underway. Normally, an appraisal process will take 1 to 2 years post-discovery, and it effectively consists of the drilling of additional wells to confirm the aerial extent and recoverable reserves of each field. If the appraisal process is in fact successful, then Apache and their partner Total will issue what is called a declaration of commerciality, informing the government that they intend to proceed with field development and production operations. So stay tuned for that. Additional deep water drilling is still planned for the offshore. I think Brian mentioned that also. Additional wells are planned over the next few years, and it is likely that additional discoveries will be reported. Now let me turn to the business environment, and I'll talk about 3 specific topics. Let me begin with corruption. And this is a theme that was touched upon last week by 1 or 2 of the prior speakers. There is no question that corruption is a concern in working in Suriname and Guyana. But I think it's also important to recognize that in the oil and gas industry, we work in many countries around the world with a much higher perceived risk to corruption than we have in Suriname and Guyana. In fact, I'll also mention that during the 4 years I worked in Suriname, leading all in-country activity for Cosmos Energy, we never were confronted with anything that could be described as corruption or corrupt intent. I think for those of you that may be thinking of opening a business in Suriname or Guyana, it is important to establish from the first day that your organization is ethical and unyielding to corruption, and if you're a US company, that you follow FCPA regulations. This will go a long way towards mitigating the concerns and risks associated with corruption. It's also worth noting on the same theme that Suriname and Guyana have both joined EITI, which is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Both countries were accepted as member countries in 2017. If you're not aware, this is a global organization where member countries commit to the transparency in the reporting of revenues from the extractive sector, being mining and petroleum operations. And membership requires that annual reports be issued to allow the citizens to hold the governments accountable for the responsible management of extractive revenues. And this also helps to mitigate government corruption. So it'll be interesting to see over the next several years as petroleum revenues begin to roll in, whether the governments continue to support this initiative, because it is only possible to maintain membership in EITI if the reports are published, annual reports are published, and this can only be done with the active cooperation and support of government authorities. The second comment I'll make about the business environment is regarding infrastructure, and this was also mentioned last week by some of the other speakers. Speakers have mentioned the need to improve roads and bridges in the region. However, a major issue impacting oil and gas operations is access to a deep water port. And a deep water port or deep water ports are being established in Guyana, but that is not yet the case in Suriname. Brian previously in the last presentation did mention some concepts are ongoing, which is great. But let me explain that the issue here is that the sea conditions in this region include very strong offshore currents flowing from Brazil northwest into the Caribbean. So large supply vessels with what we call thrusters are required to support operations. And these large supply vessels cannot enter the Suriname River and use the existing port facilities. It's just not deep enough. Over the years, there have been many plans in Suriname to improve port facilities and dredge the river. This has not yet been done. Hopefully, it is going to be ongoing soon. So consequently, because of the restrictions on port facilities, deepwater activity offshore Suriname has been conducted from Trinidad, which represents a significant loss of local content spend in Suriname. In fact, during the Cosmos 2018 two-well drilling campaign over a 10-month period, we spent millions of dollars in Trinidad, which could have gone to local content spend with businesses and employment opportunities in Suriname had adequate port facilities been available. And to be clear, deepwater drilling activity offshore Guyana also was conducted from shore bases in Trinidad. However, post the Exxon discoveries, ports have been established, or deepwater ports have been established, and Guyana will soon have enough facilities that offshore drilling activity will be fully supported from local shore bases, which will represent a significant shift in local content spend and employment opportunities from Trinidad to Guyana. The third topic I'll mention is the issue of the nature of the labor force in the region, specifically in Suriname, but also in Guyana. Again, both countries have very small local populations and few universities. Thus, there are few professionals available locally. So if you need accountants, finance people, engineers, supply chain, et cetera, you are going to be struggling to find local talent. That has been a concern for years. Most of the workforce is actually described as semi-skilled or skilled labor. So what we have is an abundance of mechanics, welders, heavy machinery operators, electricians, et cetera. And this skilled labor force can find employment opportunities in the offshore oil operations, but these local jobs will only exist if there is a local shore base. Otherwise, these offshore jobs will go to the country where the shore base is located. As I mentioned previously, Guyana is establishing deepwater ports, and currently many workers are now being hired and trained to support offshore operations. Again, hopefully the same thing will happen in Suriname. In fact, related to this issue, I will mention that during 2018, the offshore oil and gas companies were working offshore Suriname, worked with Staatsolie, the state oil company, to conduct what was called an industrial baseline study. And the purpose of this study was to evaluate the readiness of the local business sector to participate in an offshore oil development and attempt to set reasonable expectations for the population, the business community, and politicians. A major conclusion from this study was that if a local shore base was not established, and assuming the existence of a commercial offshore oil development, then Suriname-based companies would only capture between 2 and 8% of the total expenditures associated with a 20 to 30-year life cycle of an offshore project. By contrast, if a local shore base can be established, then the local content capture would be on the order of 6 to 14%. This underscores the importance of dredging the Suriname River to allow the establishment of a deepwater shore base. Otherwise, local business opportunities will be missed out, and these opportunities will instead go to Trinidad or maybe Guyana, where shore bases do exist. So in conclusion, the Exxon discoveries offshore Guyana have been transformational events, while the discoveries offshore Suriname are very exciting and yet to be confirmed to be commercial. Hopefully they will be confirmed and future discoveries will also follow. Significant business opportunities, both directly and indirectly related to the oil industry, will develop if local port facilities can be expanded to allow the support of deepwater operations. So there are challenges in the business environment, but as Brian said previously, these challenges are also opportunities that can be addressed by the government and with the support of what is a very entrepreneurial local business community in Suriname. So in closing, I'll say that Suriname is a beautiful country, a lot of natural beauty. As Brian just mentioned, over 90% of the country is pristine rainforest. So if you do travel to Suriname, whether it's tourism or for business, and if you have a sense of adventure, there are some really fantastic opportunities. It's a great country to live in. I certainly enjoyed my time there, and I certainly wish Suriname all the very best. And I'm very excited for what I see on the horizon for Suriname. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Great overview. Great things to consider when, from a business perspective in Suriname. A couple of things to remind you or to point out, we are going to spend more time this week on Q&A than last time. We didn't really have a lot of time, but so if you want to, you can either, when we get to the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and we'll recognize you, or you can, but between now and then, you can send an email to Alexandra and shoot a question ahead of time. So please do that. We're looking forward to the Q&A session. I certainly am. So our next speaker is Ned Nolan. He's the past previous U.S. ambassador to Suriname until 2018. Ambassador Nolan is a senior advisor for Transnational Strategy Group, and focusing on Suriname. So Ambassador Nolan is a 38-year veteran of the U.S. Foreign Service. In addition to Suriname, Ned served in the Netherlands, Cyprus, Canada, Ireland, Norway, and Sweden. So Ambassador Nolan is a graduate of Boston College and graduate studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So thanks for joining us today, Ambassador Nolan. Look forward to your thoughts and experiences on Suriname.
Well, thank you, Peter. I'm happy to be with you this morning. One of the great experiences I had in Suriname was beating Tom Fourier at the golf course.
That is true.
The fact that Notre Dame always crushed Boston College in football. At least I got a little bit of revenge. I want to take a somewhat broader look at Suriname, maybe with a 50,000-foot view, because I think while Suriname is becoming very well known in the oil and gas sector due to recent developments, in general, it does not have a high international profile. And one of the things I want to start with, just for the Columbia alums out there, is if it wasn't for Suriname, you might be speaking Dutch today. Because in 1667, in the Treaty of Breda, England and the Netherlands swapped Suriname for New Amsterdam. I think the Dutch maybe got the better deal for quite some time there, before New York really developed and took off. But it's really an interesting historical fact, I think, that Suriname has that connection to New York from its history. When you think about Suriname, you should think about it almost as an island nation. To the north is the Caribbean Sea. To the east and the west are rivers that, as you have heard, currently do not have bridges spanning them. So you do have to go on water to get out of the country. And to the south is an ocean of rainforest, all the way down to the Brazilian border. And it's very tightly packed on the coast and a very empty interior, but a beautiful interior. I think it has been mentioned, over 90% forested, one of the largest percentages of forested land in the world. Also something that will become increasingly important in the international sphere is fresh water. Suriname has one of the highest percentages of fresh water of any country in the world due to the rainforest. But what struck me the most in my 3 years, which was 2015 to 2018 in Suriname, was the people and the diversity of the country. It is one of the most racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse countries on earth. Because of its history, it's a mix of West African descendants who largely came as slaves. It's indentured servants who came from India, Pakistan, and the then Dutch colonies, and now Indonesia, a Chinese community, even a small Jewish community. And Suriname was one of the first Jewish settlements in the Western Hemisphere, and still has a very famous Jewish settlement site called Yom Savannah. Now that community has dwindled largely due to aging in recent years. But one of the symbols of Paramaribo, the capital, is that you have a mosque and a synagogue right next to each other that often share their parking lot for services. It's a testament to how well these different ethnic religious groups get along in a multi-ethnic society. I think they've taken the history of Dutch tolerance and made it even broader to acceptance of all communities. This doesn't mean that there aren't problems. Every country has problems, but it is, I think, a testament to the Surinamese people of how well they work together. And I do want to talk a little bit about the political situation in Suriname. There is a new government that came into office in July of last year, replacing a government that had some problematic issues due to the nature of its president. The former president was, for instance, had been convicted in the Netherlands of drug trafficking, was on trial when I was there, and subsequently found guilty for the murder of some of his political opponents in 1982, beginning a long period of military rule in Suriname. But civilian rule was restored in the early 90s. And if you look at the history of the country since then, it's had now, I believe, 7 elections that have been regarded by international observers as free and fair. Not that there are not any irregularities, but in general, free and fair. Perhaps even more importantly, it has had several peaceful transitions of power from one party to the other. We have a new government now that I think is very business oriented, law and order based, under President Santoki, a coalition government that I think is moving in the right directions. Granted, because of the global pandemic, it hasn't been able to take some of the steps it might have wanted to while it's trying to deal with that problem, as we all are around the world. And I do want to take a moment to thank President Santoki, who was helpful in getting last week Foreign Minister Ramdin, who spoke, and also with getting a representative, Brian from Statoli, to speak to us as well. Looking at some of the other political aspects, if you read the latest State Department Human Rights Report on basic human rights, the traditional human rights, freedom of the press, elections, no torture, Suriname is doing well. I mean, I've read in my 38 career hundreds of human rights reports, and I can tell you this is a good report that Suriname has gotten just recently. Good freedom of the press, as I mentioned, freedom of speech, no political prisoners. Prison conditions certainly could be better, but that's largely a resource constraint. So positive steps there. Religious freedom, very broad, very accepted. Even in some of the newer areas that we're looking at, like LGBT rights, while Suriname certainly is not perfect in those aspects, within the Caribbean region, it is one of the more advanced nations and is doing well. So I think if the government can get past the COVID pandemic, they can make some positive strides going forward. As a couple of people have mentioned, corruption is an issue. I don't want to say that it's not an issue. Money laundering has been another big problem there. And while I was ambassador, we launched a 3-year anti-money laundering program with the Attorney General's office in Suriname and the Central Bank of Suriname and the Treasury and the Finance Ministry, hopefully to address that problem. So if you're a company that's going into Suriname, you need to be aware of these issues in society. But I think, as Tom has said, from the experience I had there, not only with the oil companies who were involved, but with the other major U.S. international who is there, which is the Newmont Mining Company, which is running a very successful gold mining operation. The government has recognized the importance, when working with these international companies, of making sure that they're as corruption-free as possible, that things are done by the book, and that ethical requirements are met. So I think another positive. Yes, there is street crime in Paramaribo. There's street crime in most cities. And certainly the police forces need to be enhanced as resources allow. As ambassador, we try to support law enforcement there as well. The problem in Suriname tends not to be lack of laws. They have the laws in place that are needed. It tends to be lack of enforcement, and that is largely driven by constraints on the police and resource requirements. So hopefully with new economic development, that will also strengthen these other sectors going forward. I talk a bit about US priorities. I know not all of our audience are US based, but to give you a sense of where we have focused, Suriname has gone up and down in US priority over the years. Remarkably, during the Second World War, when bauxite was a strategic mineral for the US actually sent a garrison to Suriname to protect the bauxite supplies of about 4,000 troops. Since that time, it's come and gone in American interest. Of course, it was a Dutch colony up until 1975. And in the independence era, we haven't paid perhaps as much attention to Suriname as we have to other countries in the region. What we have always been focused on, though, is strengthening democracy, strengthening the rule of law, strengthening human rights, and supporting US economic development in the area to the extent it's there. The US has been one of Suriname's largest trading partners, and for almost a century, Alcoa was the major economic driver in Suriname with the bauxite industry, that wrapping up in 2015. So in many ways, it's been timely that the offshore sector has come into bloom and hopefully will replace some of what Suriname lost with the end of the bauxite industry going forward. As everyone has said so far, the key, I think, for Suriname's perspective is to make sure the offshore sector is not just a revenue generator. It needs to be a jobs generator and developments onshore in the economy. And I think companies who are interested in going there need to come to the table with their ideas about how they can make that happen in the future. And it's also going to be, it's important in going to Suriname that you have some experience with the different communities, the ethnic diversity, the religious diversity, and bring ideas to the table for how you can support those various communities. Corporate social responsibility programs are very important to the government of Suriname. I know Cosmos in particular funded several of those in my time there while they were still active in the country. Exxon and others are doing the same, Newmont Mining doing the same. The areas that I think you might want to bring to the table if you're going to Suriname with those ideas would be largely in education and healthcare. The healthcare system needs to be strengthened over time, and certainly assistance in those areas is greatly appreciated. Since the previous administration was in office and the former military leader, Desi Bouterse, was actually elected in a free and fair election in 2010 and served for 10 years as president. But the Netherlands largely cut off foreign assistance to Suriname early in the 2010s. And that was the largest foreign assistance provider. So Suriname was in a difficult position as many other countries have. They tended to turn to China for assistance. As you do business in Suriname, you will find not only a big Chinese community there, but a large Chinese diplomatic presence, and also a lot of projects funded by the Chinese, roads, hospitals, some as grants, some as loans. It's hard to lay any criticism on the government of Suriname because other places were not offering assistance at that time. But it is a factor you'll need to deal with should you decide to do business in Suriname. What I would recommend to anyone going there is don't think that your Latin American or South American experts are going to be particularly the best advisors to have there. Suriname, while geographically in Latin America, is strongly a Caribbean country in its mentality. So I think you want to go in and to be able to deal with the different communities, the different tensions, the different pressure groups with people who have some sense of the Guyanas and the Caribbean to make it the most successful way you can go forward. I do think, though, if you do decide to do business with Suriname, you'll find it a positive experience. As Tom has said, it's a very pleasant place to live. The people are very nice, very friendly, very warm. While Dutch is the main language of Suriname, you'll find a very heavy penetration of English, particularly in the professional classes that you're dealing with. Language will not be an obstacle to your going forward. And with the increase over time in infrastructure, hopefully, as Tom has said, dredging the river, a key, building bridges to connect the country to its neighbors in Guyana and French Guyana, also important. And I think building some hospitality infrastructure so they can develop the tourist sector. Suriname could be a world leader in ecotourism if it can get some of the infrastructure in place that would support that. So let me wrap it up there and turn it back over to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Nolan. I appreciate those. That's some great insight. Our final speaker before Q&A is Robert Downing. Just as a reminder, be prepared. You might want to send those emails in to Alexandra. She's pulling those together, I'm sure. Robert is used to live in Houston and was I believe the president in the Houston Club. Now he's the president of the South Florida Club. He's of the Columbia Business School alumni there in South Florida. He's a partner at Greenberg Traurig in Miami. Robert has 35 years of experience in domestic and international business transactions, representing multinational conglomerates on corporate structuring matters, foreign direct investment throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And Robert holds an LLM in energy, environmental, and natural resources law. And Robert's just returning from a trip to the area. So Robert, you must have a good view on what to consider about cross-border investment there.
Thank you, Peter. First of all, thanks for putting this all together along with the rest of the group, Transnational Strategy. And as I said last week when I was hosting in Peter's role, that Alexandra Kennedy deserves kudos for everything she's been doing in putting this group together. 2 sessions, Guyana more oriented last week, Suriname more oriented this week. What I'm going to do, because we've talked so much about opportunities and possibilities and what can happen, is I'm going to take the view, as I often do, as an attorney who focuses on outbound investment. In other words, you have attorneys who basically look at, if you want to invest in my country, the United States, you come to me. My focus is much more on if a company wants to go to another country, that's my specialty. That's what I do. I'm a transactional lawyer. I'm not a litigator. I work very closely with local counsel. You heard from my Dallas-based law partner, Jordan Cowman, last week about some of these issues that can come up. He went through a laundry list of considerations. I think that Ambassador Nolan pointed out, there are very important things you have to take into consideration in any jurisdiction that you go into. Okay? You will not know it all. You will learn things over time. You work with advisors. You work with people who are local. You have to do that. It's basic. It should be self-evident. In representing companies, sometimes that's not the case. You have to look at that. So what's my experience? Well, one of the best ways to think of this is in 1994, I remember working with a company out of New Mexico. They were looking at doing a privatization of a pipeline company in Mexico. So New Mexico to Mexico. And I was working with one of their very senior counsel. He had never done a international deal. And so he said to me, what is an international deal? I said, well, It's, very similar to domestic deals. You got some other considerations, but, you'll follow along the basic principles. So after 3 months of a very challenging process, I said, so Chuck, his name's Charles Garcia. I said, Chuck, what did you think of the international law? He says, well, it's like domestic law, except you eat better. And you can't really reduce it to that, but there are aspects of this that you need a framework for, which is a little bit different from when you do a purely domestic deal. And I'm going to talk about those. So the 3 things I do want to mention as a framework for going into the basin, Guyana or Suriname, or any country, but particularly Guyana and Suriname, because these are new developments, are 3 things. One is structuring, the second is risk allocation, and the third is ESG, environmental, social, corporate governance matters. All of our speakers last week and this week have touched upon it. Dr. Ramsroob last week talked about Guyana and the many, many opportunities, go invest and how you move ahead, et cetera. This week we're hearing, Brian's discussion, great opportunities. Tom's been through this. These are people who've been through it. You need to work with those type of people, understand them, meet with them, right? But how do you do it in a framework that's efficient? What we do, as I typically will do, is use that framework of structuring, risk allocation, and ESG. So let me go through the points really quickly, because I do want it to get to the Q&A. But the structuring part is so important. You will have a client, and structuring, to make it really break this down, structuring is 2 points. One is corporate planning. How is your company going to go in there? And the second, which may even be more important, is tax planning. So what often happens is someone is, let's say they're in Belgium, and they say, we want to invest in Suriname. So we'll have our Belgium company invest in Suriname. You really have to step back and see how you want to go in there, what vehicle, corporate vehicle you want to use to maximize your tax incentives, tax planning, et cetera. I know that we talked last week, again, Dr. Ramsroob talked a bit about tax incentives. Each country will have their own set of incentives to attract foreign direct investment. That has to be part of your planning process. But equally important is, how do you repatriate your funds? How do you minimize your global taxes? If you don't structure it properly up front, there's still hope, but it becomes more complicated. So for example, if there are tax treaties, if there are regional groups that you can work with, that's very important in making your investment. I can't tell you how many times we've stepped in later as attorneys and said, look, we need to change this around. We need to do something else, because this is going to subject you to a withholding tax, an excise tax, a VAT, value-added tax that you could minimize. So that's the planning part. Again, as my law partner said last week, measure twice, cut once. And this is really the part that we as transactional lawyers, we like. I don't like going to court, okay? I like to plan. I like to set this up properly. And that's what we do. We say, there's a treaty with a Dutch country, right? Maybe we can work it that way. That planning can really reduce, and for us CBS grads or business school grads, that can really affect the bottom line. It can make a huge difference. So that's the structuring part. Joint ventures. Joint ventures were talked about last week. Again, they're talked about this week, working with local groups. Many companies will not go into an area just trying to be by themselves. They need to work locally, and local content rules and other provisions, both in Suriname and in Guyana, encourage that. But how do you structure your joint venture? Who's in control? What rights do you have? A lot of those basic things need to be talked about upfront with your local partner. And that can be done with a term sheet, joint development agreement, whatever. But working those things through before you dive in makes a difference. I mentioned about the cross-border taxes. That's another part of what I consider the structuring. There's many opportunities to try to reduce those, both on the front end and when you want to get your money out. And then the last part I mentioned very briefly, local taxes. It's got to be part of the equation, part of the planning. And when you look at that, you say, wait, okay, I didn't realize there was X, Y, or Z. For example, years ago doing another deal in Mexico, we didn't realize, or as US lawyers didn't realize, that there were 3 types of taxes that would apply to a simple transfer of property. A lot of deals that will happen in both of these countries, you're hearing about, we've heard last week about the agribusiness, we're hearing about ecotourism. A lot of them will involve land. A lot of them will involve land. It'll be a key component of what you're doing. You really have to think through all the aspects of that land acquisition and possible land sale or leasing. Again, what do? I am not a real estate lawyer in either country, but I will work with local lawyers. And because of the cross-border experience, you're able to plan some things a little differently or suggest some things. So I would say that's the structuring part. The next part is risk allocation. And with risk allocation, you're really coming down to a lot of issues related to contracts and supply chain. I mean, Tom went on and on about how many things Suriname needs, which is understandable. It's a developing country, right? We need a lot of those things in the US. We have our major infrastructure push going on right now. But how does that all get done? A lot of it gets done by a supply chain, contracts, environment, you have your basic environmental issues related to that. So you've got to take those into account in designing your contracts. But what we would typically call an equipment, parts, and services contract. When I was with one of my former employers, an energy company, a lot of what we did was plan cross-border services, cross-border parts delivery, cross-border equipment delivery. You can see where all this is going to happen with the infrastructure we're talking about here. With the port development that's needed, it's ongoing, but it's also needed and will be expanded. Just think of all the suppliers that will be going in there. We know this from the oil and gas industry itself, but focusing on what will happen on that other infrastructure and how it will be supplied and what kind of contracts you'll enter into. That is going to be very important. Who will take the risk? And that's why I come down to risk allocation. Contracts, when you break them down to risk allocation, which of the two parties or three parties is going to take on this responsibility or that responsibility? Again, getting those details down up front will minimize your issues later on. They won't remove them. There's always issues. There always will be litigators in this world. But the transactional folks, we try to minimize those things by having the two parties or three parties or four, because a lot of these involve multiple parties, especially an EPC contract, an engineering procurement services contract will involve multiple parties. Who takes the risk? How do we allocate it? The last part, which was mentioned about the bid rounds, has to do with government procurement. Both of these countries will have government procurement rounds. This is just, they've done some already, there will be more. And it won't be limited to the oil and gas industry, okay? It'll be a lot of other areas, infrastructure, roads, we heard about bridges, port development. It could be housing. It could be, as we learned last week, Guyana has done quite a bit in the area of hospitality, asking for 2,000 rooms, getting requests to build 5,000. Peter had mentioned that we were down there a couple of weeks ago. And the Marriott is virtually booked because it has being taken over by the ExxonMobil folks. So you have to really look for more and more hotels. That has to develop, but also housing. When I started looking at this a few months ago, and my partner, as I say, he's worked there a little bit longer, a few years. When I first looked at this, a lot of ways I said, there's a lot of analogies to shale oil and gas development in the United States. People went out, they did great oil, they did great drilling. There was all these issues related to flaring, venting that have developed over time and they've tried to handle here in the US. You've got issues like that going on right now. But what you didn't have was the adequate infrastructure. If you look at the Bakken, you look at North Dakota, you look at various areas, the infrastructure was not there to really help deliver. And I think that a lot of what Tom said earlier goes exactly to that. Do you deepen the port? Or deepen the river? Do you dredge? All these are issues, but think of it as a business opportunity. You're going to need to set up your contracts. You're going to make sure your technology is protected and working there. And you're going to be able to supply the goods, the parts, the services. There's going to be a lot of demand for professionals in certain areas, and they will need to be able to assist people as the technology is transferred, and it will be transferred. There's going to be local content rules developing more and more. So that's going to be part of your analysis. Government procurement, how are you going to actually comply with the requirements so that you can go ahead and be successful in winning these bids? Last part, ESG. We are all hearing about ESG a lot lately. I think Ambassador Nolan's comments go to a lot of this. Part of ESG, environmental, social, corporate governance, a lot of this goes to understanding the local society and not assuming you know it. And I don't, by only going down there and having worked on a deal in Suriname 2 years ago, that I don't pretend to have the knowledge of the local society. You have to work locally. You have to talk to people who've been there for a while. Brian or others would be people to talk to in that regard. But this is one thing I tell a lot of other B school grads, because we all went through the process of net present value, cash flow, et cetera. I said, the deals that I've had stopped around the world that I've worked, Middle East, South America, even in the US, it's typically not because somebody couldn't crunch the numbers properly. They used the wrong discount rate. Well, other people checked that. What stopped it was an environmental permit or lacking some kind of permit or approval. That's one of those things you want to take care of right away. You're not only being cognizant of the environment with your ESG, but you're also saying, let's map out what exactly do I need to get this project improved. I have to go through that process. I do it up front and not find out at the last minute that you're in Peru and you're lacking that permit to turn on the pipe that's going to deliver the gas to your facility. Social consultation, this is pretty much part of a lot of things. We've seen First Nations in Canada. We've seen requirements in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. This is part of the equation too. Know the rules right away, work with the community, make sure that you are developing those relationships, and know the local regulators. I will say this, when we were in Guyana, we met with the EPA. Impressive. I mean, they think they know the challenges that they're facing, and the young folks there, and I say young because they were half my age, which is no longer a phenomenal thing, they really knew what was going on. They understood the laws, and getting back to the comments I think were made earlier, the laws are there, but they're also developing. You need to keep track of those, but also there'll be more enforcement. There will be resources for more enforcement, and you have to be cognizant of that when you're dealing with the local environmental agencies, because that's what will stop your project if you're going in on a foreign direct investment. Last one is corporate governance. Just, corporate governance can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. To me, it's a combination of being a good corporate citizen, but also it's a matter of how are you working from a simple, who's in control standpoint. I guess, to summarize all of this, we've heard again and again and again about the opportunities. You do need a framework. That framework I listed here, basically look at the structuring up front, check your risk allocation through your contracts, and then be cognizant of environmental, social, and corporate issues. That's just one framework. There's much more detail to that. But what you want to do is you want to have some framework for going in there, so you're just not saying, let me go ahead and invest, or look, this is way too complicated. I can't invest. There's too many things. I heard about corruption. Well, as Ambassador Nolan said, when I was with one of my former employers, we handled the corruption issue internally. We had a huge amount of training internally, and we were dealing in many, many challenging jurisdictions. It was a requirement, regular training. That's one way to handle that. Another way to, another challenge you might have, we talked a little bit about training. One of the things was I used to be on the board of a Saudi Arabian petrochemical company. On the board of that company, one of the key things we had was having to bring in talent in certain areas, certain expertise. I think you're seeing that, I'll say Jordan Cowman, my law partner, touched on that last week, but this is going to be a challenge anywhere. You're going to have local content rules on the one side, you're trying to satisfy. On the other hand, you want to have certain technical expertise. You're going to have to work with the local community, local regulators to see how you satisfy that. I think that's really pretty much it. I don't need to go back over the various opportunities. People have done a great job on that, an excellent job of pointing out all the opportunities, the deep water ports, obviously expansion of the oil and gas industry, but think of the other infrastructure. And I think that's where you're going to find opportunities for other companies who are not already there.
Okay, Robert, thank you very much. And before we take Q&A, I do want to thank Robert Downing, Jordan Cowman from Greenberg Traurig, and Dana Marshall of the Transnational Strategy Group for their help pulling this panel together, and the participating as speakers. And once again, I want to echo what Robert said. We couldn't have done it without Alexander Kennedy from the business school. The best support I've ever had from the business school on these things. And so you're awesome. Keep it up. Thank you. We couldn't have done it without you. So thank you again, Alexander. Alexander. So we do have some.
Peter?
Yes.
Can I
Yes,
just mention Ambassador Abadar from Suriname wanted to correct a point. If I could maybe let her come up for a moment. Are you there, Ambassador?
I'm here, Ambassador. So let me start by commenting on the excellent presentations that have been done by your very capable panelists. I just want to make 2 points, and the first point being that I do want to put on record that in the presentation that has been done by Mr. Brian Clover, an incorrect map of Suriname has been used. So I would like to request his attention for that, and also make the kind request to going forward to use the correct map for Suriname. The other thing is that I think that through the presentations, it has become very obvious that a couple of relevant infrastructural works need to be considered by the government of Suriname. And let me inform you that my government has been working with various partners in an effort to gradually start the process of starting a deep water port. The location has already been identified, and they have been engaged with partners from different continents to see how that could be made feasible and implementable in the near future. On another point, that is the element of connecting the Guyana Basin. Suriname and Guyana have been in negotiations to start with a bridge connecting Suriname with Guyana. And at the same time, we have also been in negotiations with the government of France and with other authorities to build a bridge connecting Suriname and French Guyana. With that, basically, we will have a very strong transportation environment, infrastructural environment, I should say, between French Guyana, Suriname, Guyana, all the way into Brazil and further down to the Pan-American Highway. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'm enjoying listening to the various presentations, and I look forward to the questions that will be posed by the participants during this session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ambassador Badri-Singh. I was there's probably a couple of questions that may come your way during this time. So thanks for jumping in. I appreciate that participation. So we got a couple of questions. This one may go to Robert or maybe Jordan. We had a question from Chetan Dave of how can I access regulations with regard to FDI in the region, and please cover regulations and permits for inbound investment taxation and repatriation. I think you might have covered most of that at the end, Robert, but any thoughts on the first part of that question in terms of regulations regarding to FDI, Frank, David?
Or it would be like a foreign direct investment type of restrictions. In what we've heard is, first of all, what's nice nowadays is you can get access to quite a few of the laws and regulations online by going to the various websites that the government has. And I think the ambassadors can speak to that even better than I can, certainly. But Go Invest was one resource that we used and have used and met with people for Guyana, similar types of things in Suriname. A lot of it is study. And just really quick, Peter, one thing that was mentioned last week was these are developing. A lot of the laws are developing at this point. And given that, people do need to monitor them to see how changes will be coming about, and not the least of which is the local content regulations coming out of these countries.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Appreciate that. This next question may go to Brian and Tom. The question from Mauricio Van Dam said, what's a realistic timeline for development of, and I'm assuming this is in the oil and gas side in Guyana and Suriname. Like what's the life of this thing look like? I don't know who'd like to go first.
Well, this is Tom. I'll take a quick first shot at it. Just if you're talking about the timeline from discovery to first oil, for deep water operations, typically that is on the order of no shorter than 5 or 6 years. And oftentimes it's quite a bit longer depending on the situation. But a good benchmark is the Liza discovery by Exxon. That was 5 years from discovery to first oil. And again, that was a very strong and focused effort by Exxon. So I would say for Suriname, for example, 5 years is probably the minimum. Again, certain things could happen which could speed it up a little bit, but it would be unrealistic to expect first oil before 5 years from discovery.
Okay. Dr. Glovey, do you want to add anything?
Just really to echo what Tom is saying, and to say that because we are already in the appraisal phase and we are actually significant way down the route of the FEED for an FPSO, I think the mid-2025 date that Total are posting is a very realistic date. So indeed, 5 years, you're spot on, Tom. But as I say, gas will take a little longer, that's for sure, more like 10 years.
Yep, we got it. We got a similar question from David Mark in terms of the insights in terms of the current drilling contract activity and the perspectives over the next 1 to 3 years. Anything else to add in terms of that drilling contracting, the drilling activity over the next 1 to 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just quite quickly totaling up in my head what I would expect. Certainly, in terms of exploration wells, we would probably in the next 3 to 5 years, we would expect a further between 6 and 10 in the offshore. But obviously appraisal wells, etc., will come further on from that. I mean, as I say, the way that's all he's looking at, we have a 5 to 10 year outlook in continuous exploration activities. I mean, we haven't talked about the seismic activities that are ongoing at the moment, but these are huge surveys that are being undertaken, and that will unlock more opportunities. So yeah, we had 4 rigs present at one point drilling wells in Suriname very recently. That's a record. We've never had that level of activity. It's only going to go up.
Great. We always have that. The Technip FMC provides the wellheads and subsea production equipment for Exxon's part. I'm not sure about the other areas, but that's awesome. Thank you for that. I had a question. We got it, and maybe this is to Ambassador Nolan and maybe Ambassador Badrising. With a small population, 500,000 people in a country endowed with huge oil and gas revenue streams that are about to skyrocket. What's the attitude and the opinions of the average citizen of Suriname right now? What are they thinking? Are they all driving are they all driving Lexus right now and Cadillacs? What's going on?
Well, not many people were driving the Lexus and Cadillac, but I mean, I think people are optimistic, but it's still the major revenue flows are still some years away, and in the interim, they have a lot of economic difficulties they have to get through, compounded, as I said in my presentation, by the COVID pandemic. So to some extent, I think people are thinking, let's get through this short term before we start spending money that hasn't arrived yet. I don't know. Ambassador Badrising is also in another meeting, so I don't know if she's still online, but maybe Brian or someone else would like to say something on this.
I think Ambassador's still on. Are you still there?
Yes. I'm here. I'll quickly respond. I do agree with Ambassador Nolan with regard to the question that has been posed. The other thing that I think I should mention is that the Surinamese population is very optimistic about this opportunity. I think the many actors in the private sector, they are also gearing up to become more successful entrepreneurs in various areas. And of course, the experience from Guyana also serves as an example as to what needs to be done in Suriname in order to raise the local content requirement to cope with the upcoming developments in the oil and gas sector. I think in general, the Surinamese population is aware that Suriname, that with the opportunity in Guyana, and of course with Suriname, that that region can become the next oil and gas frontier in the world. So we are very excited about it. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks for that. So a question we got from Milton Chavez along those lines, you know, do the countries welcome foreign companies to come in and strengthen and train local people? So I think that's kind of along the line of developing that.
I think the simple answer to that is yes. I saw no resistance to having that type of training come in, and they appreciated programs of training that were being offered by foreign companies coming in.
Okay.
Peter, I just mentioned if Jordan is available, he's actually worked specifically on those areas of having people come in and working with your company. And so if he might be able to say a couple words about, I mean, I know my impression, at least in Guyana, was certainly that there was that, as Ambassador Nolan saying, there was that welcoming effect. Jordan, if you're available, can you comment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the environment is very welcoming in terms of having people come in, having companies come in and train those locals. It's something that not only is part of their policy, but also, you know, it just makes for a very smart business to get those locals involved, up and trained. And my experience has been that they're very welcoming, just as Ambassador Nolan said. So I completely agree with that. And I would certainly not let that stand in my way.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Yeah, just from my point of view and my experience in country, I think I agree with those comments, but I will add that there's a pretty entrepreneurial local business community. It's small, but it's very entrepreneurial. And I think they certainly would welcome the additional international investment. But I believe what a lot of these companies, local companies, are looking for are strategic partners, where they want to participate in the direct and indirect commercial opportunities from the offshore, and they'd like to do so in strategic partnerships. So I think they would be very welcoming to find companies that come into Suriname that look for those opportunities. I think just moving a company in and just doing something on your own would obviously be less welcoming than trying to partner up with some of these companies that will provide you the local knowledge and the assistance to actually make things happen quite efficiently. It's just about finding the right strategic partners to make things work properly.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So another question from Milton, are banks allowed to open bank accounts in US dollars? So I guess one question is, are there US dollar bank accounts in Suriname? And I think that maybe the follow-on question is, are foreigners allowed to open bank accounts in US dollars in Suriname? And then I had a kind of a second question on, which is what does the land ownership look like there? Is what's the ability? There's land's a big issue. That was one thing, Robert, you brought up in terms of land. But what are the land ownership constraints? So first, bank accounts. I don't know if that's.
Can I take that?
Or not. Sure.
Simply because I have direct experience of that. If you can hear me, okay, Peter.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's no limitations from a dollar perspective. You can have a dollar account. A foreigner can open up a bank account. There is a fairly sophisticated banking network within Suriname, and there are multiple different banks available as well. So there's no real limitations. Sometimes there's some issues with respect to credit card usage and how that's developed. It's maybe not as sophisticated as people and businesses might like, but in general, everything is in place. Maybe a little bit slow at times, a bit clunky, but it works.
Okay, thanks. What about land ownership regulations?
I think I'm going to pass on that one. That's complicated.
Robert, or
I'm trying to remember. My memory is not perfect on this issue, but there is an issue where you tend to get long-term leases onto land rather than direct property ownership. And you could ask me 2 years ago, I'd have known it inside and out, but I don't want to offer wrong information, so I better leave it at that.
okay.
Yeah, I think, Peter, the only thing to say, that is truly, as they say, all real estate is local. That is where we typically would work with a local person. But I do know that people who have been able to do and joint ventures or as strategic partnerships, if there is land involved, that has not been an obstacle, whether it's a lease or whatever it happens to be, the structuring of that to moving forward. But I am not in any way opining upon the real estate laws of either country. As Brian says, I won't touch that one either. That's just you check with your local attorney as to how you acquire land and things like that. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Ambassador has a comment on this.
Yeah. So I have someone from the embassy as well following this discussion. So I got word from her that a question about land ownership has been there. In general, when it comes to private land, purchasing of land is exclusive right private land to Surinamese and those with permanent residency. However, but I know that all these many issues in relation to foreign investments are being revisited, and so will the issues be when it comes to land. Now, there is a possibility that if foreign companies are collaborating with Surinamese companies in partnership, that out of a business arrangement, land can be purchased. But an international company just coming in and purchasing the land, that would be difficult. It's being provided for extended lease. That has been the case for the gold mining companies, and also for other companies that are active in the extractive sector. I know, well, recently, the Parliament, last week, Parliament approved the establishment of what is called the Suriname National Foreign Investment Enterprise, which will basically serve as the investment authority of Suriname. And they will deal with many of the aspects that need to be put in place to gradually deal with the many aspects of developing the oil and gas business in the near future. We know that we are talking about 4 years from now. So my government is taking the necessary actions to be ready by the time that Suriname is ready for oil production. So in short, I think this is also a matter that will be revisited in the near future because the demands will be different. So thank you, Ambassador, and thank you as much.
Okay. Thank you. There was a follow-up question, and maybe I think we've got Mark Bino on this call. The question was, are banks in Guyana, the same question for Guyana, are they allowed to open bank accounts in dollars there? I thought, did I see Mark on on the call?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, as we said last week.
That's not me, is it? I think Mark just spun away somewhere. Are you still there, Mark?
Yes, sorry about that. As I was saying, that's my delegation. Apologies. As I said last week, Guyana has liberalized its exchange rate regime. You are free to open banks in Guyana. You're also able to repatriate 100% of your returns. And in a large way, we are also very keen on establishing joint ventures. But yes, the regime here is very, very liberalized. And this started since back in 1991. Thank you.
Okay.
If we are to look, sorry, if we are to look at with regards to land, again, as someone mentioned earlier, a good starting place would be Go Invest, the Guyana Office for Investment. But again, land is often available on a leasehold basis. If you're purchasing from a private individual, there are no barriers therein. But for a leasehold basis, you're expected to put forward a development plan, an investment plan with regards to what you intend to do, how the economy is expected to benefit, how many persons you will be employing, and so forth. And then Go Invest will examine that proposal and work with you in terms of advancing your potential interest in the area. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. I think that we are getting to the end of our questions. There was one follow-on question. Probably this will be the last question in terms of does Suriname have an approved local content policy, an actual policy for local content on oil and gas? I think the question would be with regard first, at least with regard to oil and gas development.
Yeah.
This is Jordan speaking. Yes, absolutely, they do. Nothing's been enacted by the legislature, but they do have local content policy. In fact, you can find it on their website, of the government's website. Those types of things, those local content policies that they have published, don't have. They're precatory. In other words, they're not mandatory. They don't have teeth. There's no enforcement mechanism, but they are very. It's very, let's say, a word to the wise to follow and heed those things, because I think there are going to be legislative changes coming, and one of those legislative changes may very well be that those types of local content policies do get teeth and enforcement mechanisms.
Okay, thanks, Jordan, for that. That is our last question, and I do want to thank participants today, Dr. Glover, Tom Forvia, Ambassador Nolan, Robert Downing. Thank you very much once again, Alexandra Kennedy. You know, from your finger, from the participants' fingers to your computer to my iPhone, we made it happen on the Q&A. So once again, and thanks everybody for participating and sending the questions in. Very informative, and we'll look forward to having you in another one of these events in the future. So thank you. I hope everybody has a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.